Have you ever wondered what happens when powerful people think they can crush your life over a contract? They thought I was a quiet drone who would just bow down, but they forgot one core rule. You never take everything from the person holding the keys to your empire. That night, listening to the sterile beep of a heart monitor, I did not cry. I just counted down the seconds until their $500 million system collapsed. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. I want to sincerely thank all of you for your incredible support over the years, but unfortunately, YouTube has demonetized our channel, leaving us with absolutely no budget to continue operating here, which means we will not be uploading new videos on this platform in the near future. We are officially moving our operations over to Patreon. So if you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon family to hear even better, longer, and more detailed, exclusive true stories featuring multiple emotional voice actors that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can easily join us by scanning the Patreon QR code on your screen right now or by clicking the link located in the video description and pinned comment below. Now, let us dive straight into today's story, where you will meet a woman named Natalie Ward. I am 34 years old, and until tonight, I was the lead systems architect at Aegis Freight Networks. We are a towering transportation technology conglomerate based in the freezing heart of Chicago. To give you an idea of the sheer scale of my work, my code manages the logistical flow of goods across exactly 1/3 of the United States, from critical medical supplies to massive retail inventory. If it moves on a truck or a freight train, it likely passes through my digital gates. Today was supposed to be the absolute pinnacle of my professional career. We were exactly 45 minutes away from hitting the master launch button on Project Apex. This was not just a routine software update. It was a massive, sweeping system overhaul valued at $500 million. The server control room hummed with a tense, electric energy. The glowing screens cast a pale blue light over my face as my fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, running the final diagnostic checks. Every single indicator flashed green. The system was flawless, secure, and ready to dominate the market. Then, the piercing vibration of my personal cell phone shattered my concentration. It was sitting on the edge of the metal desk, and the caller ID flashed the emergency line of Central General Hospital. My stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. I answered the phone with a trembling hand, and the frantic voice on the other end delivered the words that completely destroyed my world. My husband, Mark, who serves as a rescue captain with the Chicago Fire Department, had been caught inside a catastrophic warehouse collapse during a massive structural fire. A falling steel beam had crushed his chest, and the paramedics were rushing his broken body into a life-or-death emergency surgery. The trauma doctor on the line told me his chances of surviving the night were incredibly slim. I needed to be at the hospital immediately. Pure, unadulterated panic seized my chest, squeezing the oxygen right out of my lungs. But the cold, sterile, gray environment of the Aegis corporate headquarters offered absolutely no comfort. The digital ticking clock on the wall reminded me that I had exactly 42 minutes until the nationwide launch. I did not care. I grabbed my leather tote bag and sprinted down the long, carpeted hallway toward the executive boardroom. The soundproof glass walls of the executive suite revealed exactly the kind of soulless corporate machine I was up against. Inside the spacious room, Julian Sterling, our billionaire chief executive officer, and Fiona Thorne, the ruthless vice president of operations, were already celebrating their impending victory. They stood proudly by a massive, polished mahogany table, clinking crystal glasses of expensive vintage champagne. They were toasting to the $500 million success that my exhausted brain and countless sleepless nights had built for them. I pushed the heavy glass door open with enough force to rattle the hinges, shattering their pristine, quiet moment of corporate triumph. Julian frowned deeply, lowering his crystal glass as he took in the sight of my pale, terrified, and sweat-drenched face. I did not have the time or the patience for corporate pleasantries or polished presentations. I told them exactly what was happening in short, frantic breaths. I explained the horrific warehouse collapse, the shattered ribs, The massive internal bleeding, the emergency surgery, and the terrifying fact that the man I loved more than anything might not survive the next 2 hours. I told them I needed an immediate leave of absence for just 3 days to be by his side in the intensive care unit. I spoke fast, assuring them both that Project Apex was perfectly calibrated and ready to go. I had personally written every single line of the deployment protocol myself, and the system was fully automated to execute the launch flawlessly without my physical presence. All they needed to do was sit in their comfortable leather chairs and watch the green progress bars fill up on the monitors. Fiona let out a loud, dramatic sigh and actually rolled her eyes. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her expensive drink, acting as if my husband bleeding out on an operating table was nothing more than a minor scheduling inconvenience meant to ruin her evening. Julian did not even blink with an ounce of human empathy. Instead, he swirled the golden champagne in his glass, letting a cruel, arrogant smirk creep across his perfectly shaved face. "Firefighters know the occupational hazards when they sign up for the job," Julian said, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. "But you, Natalie, are paid $300,000 a year to be standing in this building right now. This is a $500 million deployment, the biggest in our company history. You do not get to just walk away and abandon your post because of a personal domestic problem." I stared at him, my heart pounding so violently against my ribs that I thought it might break through my chest. I opened my mouth to plead with him, but he immediately raised a manicured hand to silence me. "Let me make this perfectly clear to you," he continued, his tone turning into a heavy block of solid ice. "You step out of that door, and you lose absolutely everything. You lose your senior position. You lose your unvested company stock. You lose your husband's corporate health insurance while he is literally lying on an operating table racking up a massive medical bill. You walk out that door, and your future in the tech industry is completely dead. I will personally make sure you never write another line of code in this city." The air in the glass boardroom stood absolutely still. The digital countdown clock on the massive monitor behind them ticked away the seconds until the launch, echoing in the deafening silence. But my mind was a million miles away from their pathetic corporate empire. Standing right beside Mark in the sterile, blinding light of a hospital room, Julian and Fiona stared down at me with triumphant, predatory eyes. They honestly believed they had me cornered like a frightened animal. They thought the terrifying threat of sudden financial ruin and the cruel loss of life-saving medical insurance would force me to quietly sit back down at my desk, wipe away my tears, and prioritize their precious cargo routes over the fragile life of my dying husband. But in that defining moment, all of my frantic panic completely evaporated. The raw, suffocating terror was instantly replaced by a cold, sharp, calculating clarity. I did not shed a single tear for them to enjoy. I stood up straight, looked deep into Julian's cold eyes, and held his gaze with a terrifying intensity until his arrogant smirk finally faltered just a fraction of an inch. I slowly reached up to the collar of my silk blouse, unclipped my silver corporate identification badge, and slammed it down onto the polished mahogany table. The heavy plastic and metal hit the expensive wood with a loud, sharp clack that echoed violently through the quiet glass room, without uttering a single word in response to his pathetic threats. I turned my back on both of them and walked straight out the heavy door. I left the two most powerful executives in the building standing there in stunned, absolute disbelief. They thought they had just ruined my life and secured their victory. They had absolutely no idea that they had just forced my hand, and in doing so, they had just guaranteed the total destruction of their own empire. The ride to Central General Hospital was a chaotic blur of neon city streetlights streaking across the wet glass of my rideshare window. In the suffocating darkness of the back seat, my mobile phone vibrated with a relentless, rhythmic aggression against my thigh. The screen lit up over and over again, illuminating the dark interior with a barrage of automated alerts and highly aggressive text messages. They were all coming directly from the Human Resources Department, undoubtedly orchestrated by Fiona Thorne in real time. The subject line screamed at me in bold capital letters: "Notice of immediate termination. Cancellation of health benefits. revocation of severance packages. She was weaponizing the corporate bureaucracy, trying to bury me in legal paperwork and absolute panic before I even reached the sliding doors of the emergency room. I did not even bother unlocking the screen. I simply flipped the device face down on the cracked leather seat, my mind completely detached from their pathetic corporate temper tantrum. Instead, as the car sped through the slick, rain-washed city streets, my thoughts drifted backward in time, returning to exactly 4 years ago. That was the pivotal year when I first laid down the foundational architecture for the Aegis Freight Security Corps. Even back then, I knew exactly what kind of monsters I was working for. I intimately understood the bottomless, insatiable greed that infected the top floors of the executive glass tower. To people like Julian and Fiona, the millions of tons of physical cargo, the thousands of massive autonomous trucks, and the endless miles of heavy railway were nothing more than abstract numbers on a quarterly profit spreadsheet. They did not care about engine temperature thresholds, severe weather warnings, or the physical exhaustion limits of the human beings working on the ground. If they could somehow squeeze out an extra 15% in profit by running the entire logistics network dangerously hot, they would do it without a second thought. Because I knew this absolute truth, I did not just build a standard security firewall, I secretly embedded a highly classified, deep-level safeguard far beneath the master kernel of the system. I named it the Black Widow Protocol. Let me be perfectly clear about what this was. It was absolutely not a malicious virus. It was not a destructive cyberworm or a piece of rogue ransomware designed to extort the company for financial gain. It was something far more elegant, brilliant, and devastating. It was a blind, uncompromising gatekeeper. The protocol acted as an ultimate self-defense mechanism for the entire national logistical network. I designed it to remain completely dormant, utterly invisible to every standard diagnostic scan, waking up only under one very specific and dangerous condition. If the executive leadership layer ever attempted to force the routing algorithms to push past their critical safety limits, and they tried to execute that command without the direct, biometric authorization of the chief systems architect, the system would act to save itself. It would not just crash or reboot. It would intentionally and methodically lock down every single server, completely freezing every physical transportation asset in the network to prevent a catastrophic failure. It was a digital dead man switch, and I was the only person on the face of the earth who possessed the key. The brakes of the car squealed sharply as we finally pulled up to the glowing red emergency room entrance. I sprinted inside, my lungs burning fiercely as the harsh, clinical smell of bleach and antiseptic hit the back of my throat. I navigated the maze of corridors until I found the surgical waiting area, a desolate hallway lined with pale green walls and rigidly uncomfortable plastic chairs. A sympathetic trauma nurse met me halfway down the hall. Her tired eyes were filled with a quiet, heavy pity as she handed me a clear plastic evidence bag containing my husband's personal effects. Inside the thick plastic was his heavy firehouse undershirt, torn straight down the middle and completely soaked in dark, heavy crimson. My hands trembled violently as I reached out to take it. When I pressed my bare fingers against the outside of the bag, they came away stained with a smear of his wet blood that had seeped through the zipper. I slumped heavily into a plastic chair in the empty, freezing corridor, staring blankly at the bright red stains on my skin. For a long, agonizing moment, the entire universe shrank down to the rhythmic, terrifying hum of the hospital ventilation system. Then, from inside my leather tote bag, my encrypted work laptop emitted a single, sharp chime. I pulled the heavy silver machine onto my lap and flipped open the screen. My secure administrative dashboard loaded instantly, cutting through the darkness. Right in the dead center of the display was an urgent, flashing prompt sent directly from the executive boardroom. Julian had just hit the master launch sequence for the $500 million project, but because the system immediately recognized that the new cargo loads were heavily unbalanced and fundamentally unsafe, it had automatically thrown up a massive red wall of critical error warnings. Julian and Fiona were currently trying to forcibly push the fragile system into the red zone anyway. The prompt flashing on my screen was an automated request asking for my supreme administrative permission to bypass all safety protocols. They desperately needed me to authorize the manual override. I sat there in the sterile silence of the hospital hallway, my blood-stained fingers hovering over the glowing mechanical keyboard. I did not need to hack the corporate mainframe. I did not need to frantically write a single line of destructive code or launch a complex cyber attack. All I had to do was absolutely nothing. With a calm, terrifying precision, I moved the cursor directly over the bright red button labeled Deny Request. I pressed down firmly on the glass trackpad. A small, heavy lock icon appeared on the screen, signaling that the safety warnings were now permanently sealed in place and could never be bypassed. I quietly folded the laptop shut, listening to the soft click of the magnetic latch as the screen went completely dark. I leaned my heavy head back against the cold cinder-block wall, closed my eyes tightly, and began to pray for the man fighting for his life in the operating room just a few doors away. I did not need to lift another finger. I simply sat there in the shadows, leaving Julian and Fiona to their own bottomless arrogance, knowing with absolute certainty that their desperate greed was about to pull the trigger on their own execution. Back up on the 80th floor of the Aegis Glass Fortress, the atmosphere was thick with a toxic, blinding arrogance. Julian straightened his expensive Italian silk tie, completely unbothered by my dramatic exit just minutes prior. To him, I was just another replaceable cog in his massive corporate machine. He truly believed that software engineers were a dime a dozen, easily swapped out like burnt light bulbs the moment they became inconvenient. Fiona stood right beside him, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming impatiently on the edge of the master control console. The global media embargo for their massive announcement was scheduled to lift in just a few short hours. The morning financial news networks were already preparing their glowing spotlight segments on the revolutionary $500 million launch of Project Apex. They simply could not afford a delay. They absolutely refused to let a crying wife and a dying firefighter stand in the way of their ultimate crowning corporate achievement. "Initiate the master sequence," Julian commanded, his voice dripping with an unearned theatrical authority. Fiona did not hesitate for a single second. She slid right into the warm leather chair I had just abandoned, bypassing my suspended user account and logging directly into the core using her executive vice president credentials. She dragged the digital slider across the glass screen and clicked the final authorization prompt without a second thought. Instantly, a massive, ungodly tidal wave of raw logistical data slammed into the central servers. We are talking about the real-time routing information for millions of tons of physical cargo, complex weather algorithms, and live national traffic metrics, all trying to compress into a delicate framework that was currently begging for structural balance. Almost immediately, the glowing green displays inside the control center began to flicker. The massive cooling units in the subterranean server farms kicked into maximum overdrive, sounding like a fleet of commercial jetliners preparing for an emergency takeoff. The intense vibrations actually rattled the polished floorboards of the executive suites. The system was smart. It knew the new data loads were mathematically impossible to execute safely under the current parameters. One by one, bright crimson warning panels started popping up across the massive panoramic screens covering the front wall of the room. Server rack temperatures spiked violently. Central processing memory usage skyrocketed to 99% capacity in a matter of seconds. The automated safety governors desperately tried to throttle the data flow, literally screaming at the human operators to halt the deployment. The entire control room echoed with the sharp, rhythmic blaring of digital sirens. Dozens of junior technicians scrambled in their seats, their voices rising in genuine panic as they shouted out reports of cascading system errors and localized server crashes. But Fiona just sneered. She viewed the system's desperate warnings not as a catastrophic structural failure, but merely as a minor software annoyance standing in her way. "Mute those ridiculous alarms right now," she snapped at the lead network engineer, a young man who was visibly sweating completely through his blue dress shirt. When he hesitated, his hands shaking as he cited the severe risk of a total mainframe meltdown. Fiona violently shoved him aside. "If you will not do your job, I will do it myself," she hissed angrily. She pulled up her highest-tier administrator control panel. She aggressively typed in her master override password, fully intent on forcing the system to swallow the data whole, just to ensure the morning press conference went off without a hitch. She completely ignored the flashing red text begging her to reconsider. She checked the small digital box labeled "Disable all critical warnings" and slammed her palm down hard on the Enter key. The digital clock on the master console flipped to exactly 1:15 in the morning. That specific keystroke was the fatal catalyst. The moment her forced override command registered in the core registry, it reached down into the deepest, darkest trenches of my code. It found the sleeping giant. The Black Widow protocol woke up. The transition was not slow. It was instantaneous and absolutely violent. The deafening, blaring sirens abruptly cut off, plunging the chaotic room into a suffocating, dead silence. Then, every single monitor in the command center, from the massive wall displays down to the smallest desktop screens, flickered violently and snapped to a deep, pitch black. The technicians gasped in unison. Julian stepped forward in shock, his crystal champagne glass slipping directly from his hand and shattering into 100 jagged pieces on the hardwood floor. For 3 agonizing seconds, the screens remained completely dark. Then, a single line of stark, glowing red text materialized in the dead center of every single monitor in the building. It did not flash. It just sat there, burning itself into their retinas. Critical executive override detected, fatal lockdown, entire supply chain frozen. The catastrophe did not just stay isolated inside the glass walls of the Aegis Tower. It exploded across the entire North American continent at the exact same millisecond, out on a desolate stretch of interstate highway somewhere in the middle of Nevada. A massive convoy of 40 autonomous freight trucks, each hauling 80,000 pounds of highly sensitive commercial electronics, simultaneously killed their engines. The massive rigs engaged their emergency air brakes in perfect unison, coming to a heavy, shuddering halt right in the middle of the dark highway, their amber hazard lights blinking silently into the empty desert night. Deep in the snowy mountains of Colorado, a massive automated freight train carrying thousands of gallons of industrial chemicals ground to a screeching, sparking stop on the icy tracks, entirely deaf to the frantic radio calls from the regional dispatchers. Down at the major commercial shipping ports in California, massive automated cranes froze mid-air, dangling steel shipping containers, weighing tens of thousands of pounds completely motionless against the night sky. Dock workers stared in total confusion at their dead tracking tablets. Over 12,000 physical vehicles just stopped breathing. The digital heartbeat of the American supply chain completely flatlined. Within 60 seconds, the Aegis customer support switchboards lit up like a massive forest fire. Thousands upon thousands of furious shipping partners, retail giants, and frantic logistics managers began calling in simultaneously, screaming at the terrified operators. The hold queues instantly maxed out at 10,000 callers. The economic damage was not just accumulating by the minute, it was compounding by the second, bleeding millions of dollars into the night air. Back in the glass boardroom, the arrogant triumph on Julian's face had completely melted away, replaced by a pale, sickening horror. The veins in his neck bulged as he slammed both of his fists down on the unresponsive console. "Fixers! Fix it right now!" he roared, his voice cracking with genuine, unadulterated terror. "Reboot the master servers. Roll back to the previous version. Do something." The control room was a madhouse of frantically typing fingers and terrified shouts. The IT captain, a brilliant veteran engineer who had spent over 20 years in the cybersecurity industry, was desperately hammering away at his mechanical keyboard. He was sweating profusely, trying to find a back door, a side channel, absolutely any possible way to regain access to the master routing tables. His face was entirely drained of blood, glowing like a pale ghost in the dim emergency lighting of the room, after 10 grueling minutes of total, absolute failure. He slowly pushed his chair back from his desk. He turned around to face Julian, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip his knees just to steady them. He looked the billionaire CEO dead in the eyes and delivered the final, crushing blow. "I cannot do anything, sir," the IT captain whispered, his voice trembling with sheer disbelief. "It is not a software glitch. The entire core architecture is sealed behind military-grade encryption. It is dynamically shifting its security keys every 5 seconds. The master routing tables are completely locked out from the inside. We have lost total control of the network." By 8 o'clock the following morning, the sun was rising brightly over the city of Chicago, but inside the executive glass boardroom of the Aegis Tower, the atmosphere was as dark and suffocating as a subterranean bunker during a nuclear fallout. The arrogant, celebratory energy from the previous night had completely evaporated, instantly replaced by a thick, heavy stench of pure panic, stale coffee, and desperate fear. When the financial markets opened at 9:30 in the morning, the absolute devastation became a public spectacle. Within the first 2 hours of active trading, hundreds of millions of dollars had violently vanished from the market capitalization of the company. The stock price was in a terrifying freefall, plummeting by over 30% as unconfirmed rumors of a completely paralyzed national supply chain leaked to the eager financial press. Julian was pacing frantically back and forth across the expensive carpet. His Italian silk tie loosened around his neck, his eyes completely bloodshot from a total lack of sleep. But it was Fiona who was truly spiraling out of control, like all corporate parasites facing their own inevitable destruction. Her immediate, primal survival instinct was to aggressively shift the blame onto someone lower on the organizational chart. She was practically hyperventilating, pacing around the mahogany table and shrieking, her sharp voice echoing violently off the soundproof glass walls. "This is deliberate, malicious sabotage," Fiona shouted, pointing an accusatory finger at the empty chair where I had been sitting just hours before. Natalie Ward is a disgruntled, unstable employee who just committed an act of domestic terrorism. She obviously planted a hidden ransomware virus right before she walked out that door. She deliberately orchestrated this entire systemic collapse to extort us just because I refused to grant her a ridiculous leave of absence. "We need to get the Federal Bureau of Investigation on the phone right now. I want the Federal Cyber Division on a private jet from Washington down here to arrest her immediately for sabotaging our national security infrastructure." She was desperate, violently weaving a wild, fabricated narrative of corporate espionage to cover up her own fatal incompetence. Julian, who was equally desperate to find a convenient scapegoat to present to the furious and panicked shareholders, was actually nodding along with her insane theory. They were standing by the speakerphone, just seconds away from dialing the federal authorities, when the heavy glass boardroom doors swung open with a loud thud. Donovan Reed, the director of cybersecurity, walked into the room. Unlike the sweating, panicking executives who were losing their minds, Donovan was completely calm, coldly calculating, and armed with undeniable digital proof. He was a seasoned veteran of digital forensics, a man who spoke entirely in binary facts, hard data, and unshakable logic rather than empty corporate spin. He did not offer a single word of polite greeting. He simply walked straight to the head of the long mahogany table, plugged his heavily encrypted tablet into the main display console, and projected his diagnostic findings onto the massive panoramic wall monitor for every single person in the room to see. "Nobody is calling the federal authorities, Fiona," Donovan stated, his voice deadly flat and completely devoid of any respect for her senior executive title, "because we have absolutely nothing to report to them regarding an external attack, a virus, or employee sabotage." Fiona stopped pacing and crossed her arms tightly, glaring at him with pure venom. "Are you blind, Donovan? Look at the tracking boards. The entire national transportation network is completely frozen. She obviously locked us out." "Let us look at the actual forensic data before you make a fool of yourself," Donovan replied coldly, tapping the glass screen of his tablet. A massive, incredibly complex timeline of system access logs and security registries appeared on the wall. "I have spent the last 7 hours running a deep, exhaustive structural audit of the entire core framework. First of all, the external perimeter firewall is completely intact. There is absolutely no breach, no virus, and no ransomware. Secondly, I pulled the direct modification history for Natalie Ward. According to the immutable server logs, Natalie has not inserted, modified, or deleted a single line of code in the past 6 months. Furthermore, her user credentials were automatically suspended the exact second she surrendered her physical badge last night. She has not logged into the network, neither locally nor remotely, since she walked out of this room. Julian stopped dead in his tracks, his brow furrowing in deep, panicked confusion. If she did not write a malicious virus, and she did not trigger a remote cyber attack, then why are 12,000 autonomous freight trucks currently sitting dead on the national highways? Because the system is doing exactly what it was fundamentally designed to do, Donovan explained, his tone shifting into the patronizing, exhausted register of a frustrated teacher speaking to incredibly slow children. It is aggressively protecting itself from being permanently destroyed. The architecture was never attacked. It initiated a calculated defensive lockdown to prevent a catastrophic mainframe meltdown. Donovan dragged his finger across his tablet, rapidly filtering out thousands of lines of complex code until only one single, glaring entry remained on the massive screen. He magnified the text until the bright red letters were large enough for everyone in the room to read clearly from 50 feet away. This is the final administrative action logged by the core registry before the system severed our control, Donovan announced, pointing directly at the undeniable digital fingerprint left at the scene of the crime. The glowing red text on the massive screen read aloud in plain English. Protocol triggered. Fatal overload prevented. Account. Fiona_Thorne intentionally deleted safety firewalls and forced system execution despite critical hardware risks, initiating total supply chain freeze to preserve core integrity. A dead. Suffocating silence immediately slammed down over the entire glass boardroom. The relentless humming of the ceiling air conditioning unit was the only sound left in the room. The cold, irrefutable logic of the system had just completely shattered their pathetic, cowardly attempt at a cover-up. Every single pair of eyes in the room slowly turned away from the glowing digital screen and locked directly onto Fiona. The aggressive, arrogant energy completely drained from her body in an instant. The color rapidly rushed out of her face, leaving her looking like a terrified, cornered ghost. She began to sweat profusely, the heavy beads of moisture ruining her expensive morning makeup and dripping down her neck. She opened her mouth to speak, desperately searching for another excuse, another lie, or another person to throw under the bus. But no words came out. Julian just stared at the massive screen, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like his teeth might actually shatter. The terrifying, crushing reality finally washed over him. He realized in that exact moment that there was absolutely no anonymous hacker to hunt down. There was no disgruntled employee to sue or arrest. They could not push this catastrophic $500 million failure onto my shoulders. The system was completely dead because Fiona had carelessly murdered it, and Julian had handed her the weapon. The catastrophic bleeding of our market value did not just stay confined to the trading floors of Chicago. The absolute financial slaughter echoed all the way to the towering skyscrapers of Manhattan, ringing directly in the ears of the executive board of directors. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy, suffocating atmosphere inside the Aegis boardroom shifted from frantic panic to a paralyzed, deathly dread. Vivian Croft had arrived. Vivian was the chairwoman of the board, a notoriously ruthless corporate titan who possessed a reputation so cold and terrifying that even seasoned Wall Street veterans refused to look her directly in the eyes. She did not bother with a scheduled commercial flight. The second she received the emergency briefing about the frozen national supply chain, she boarded her private jet in New York and flew directly into the brewing storm in Chicago. When Vivian walked through the heavy glass doors of the executive suite, the temperature in the room seemingly dropped by 20 degrees. She was a striking woman in her late 60s, dressed in an immaculate, razor-sharp, dark charcoal suit, carrying an aura of absolute, crushing authority, the kind of power that made arrogant men like Julian Sterling suddenly look like frightened. helpless children. Julian immediately jumped out of his leather chair, his hands visibly shaking as he tried to force a welcoming, confident smile onto his exhausted face. Fiona practically glued her back to the glass wall, desperate to blend into the background and disappear completely. They both started talking at the exact same time, a pathetic, overlapping chorus of desperate excuses, technical jargon, and frantic promises that they had the situation entirely under control. Vivian did not even acknowledge their physical presence. She did not offer a polite greeting, and she did not ask them to sit down. She simply walked over to the head of the mahogany table, picked up the printed physical copy of Donovan Reed and his forensic diagnostic report, and began to read. In total silence, for 5 agonizing minutes, the only sound in the massive room was the sharp, crisp rustle of thick paper as Vivian turned the pages. Julian stood frozen in place, a heavy bead of sweat trailing slowly down the side of his pale face. When Vivian finally finished reading the irrefutable proof of their catastrophic incompetence, she casually tossed the thick stack of papers back onto the polished wood. She slowly raised her head, her piercing gray eyes locking on to Julian with the lethal precision of a sniper. She completely ignored the mountain of excuses he had just vomited into the air. She only cared about the brutal, objective reality of the bottom line. "I have only one question," Vivian said, her voice dropping into a quiet, chilling register that carried into every corner of the silent room. "Who is the only person on this entire planet capable of unlocking this system and getting my freight trucks moving again?" Julian opened his mouth, but his throat was completely dry. He choked on his own breath, entirely unable to form a single coherent word. All eyes turned to Donovan Reed. The director of cybersecurity stepped forward, clutching his encrypted tablet tightly to his chest like a physical shield. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously as he prepared to deliver the fatal blow to his superiors. "The core framework is permanently locked behind a dynamic biometric firewall," Donovan explained, keeping his voice incredibly steady and focusing solely on the unshakable facts. "There is no back door, and there is no physical override switch. The absolute only way to thaw the national supply chain is with the unique biometric retinal scan and the cognitive passphrase belonging to our lead systems architect, Natalie Ward." Vivian narrowed her eyes slightly, processing the information with the speed of a supercomputer. "Then why is this woman not currently standing in this room fixing my $500 million problem?" Donovan took a slow, deep breath. He did not even look at Julian or Fiona when he dropped the guillotine blade. "Because the Human Resources Department just sent out the automated daily roster update. Julian Sterling and Fiona Thorne officially terminated her employment late last night, effectively severing her network access and revoking all of her corporate credentials." A heavy, dangerous silence descended upon the executives. Vivian slowly turned her terrifying gaze back to Julian. The billionaire CEO shrank under her stare, suddenly looking incredibly small and utterly pathetic. Vivian let out a dark, hollow scoff that sounded like a dry crack of thunder. She reached out, grabbed the thick employee personnel file sitting on the table, and threw it violently. The heavy folder struck Julian squarely in the chest, sending hundreds of loose papers fluttering to the floor like dead leaves. "Let me make sure I understand the absolute sheer magnitude of your stupidity," Vivian whispered, taking a slow, predatory step toward him. "You just fired the single person holding the literal lifeblood of this entire multinational corporation. And you fired her because she asked for a temporary leave of absence to go to a hospital and save the life of her dying husband? You are not a chief executive officer. Julian, you are an absolute, uncompromising idiot." Julian stared down at his expensive leather shoes, his face burning with a bright, humiliating red flush. He had absolutely no defense. The corporate hierarchy he had weaponized against me just 12 hours ago had now completely turned around to devour him whole. Vivian did not waste another second on his pathetic display of shame. She turned her back to him, her voice ringing out with absolute, undeniable command. "Pick up the phone," Vivian ordered, pointing a sharp, manicured finger at the central console. "Call her right now. Put the audio on the main room speaker so I can hear—" Every single word. And you had better get down on your knees and pray to whatever God you believe in that she actually decides to answer. The ringing of the speakerphone cut through the dead silence of the executive boardroom like a sharp knife, down in the intensive care unit. I sat beside a sterile white hospital bed, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of Mark's chest. I let the phone ring 4 times before I finally swiped the green button on my screen. The line connected, broadcasting my voice into the very room I had walked out of the night before. Beneath my breathing, the steady, rhythmic beep of the hospital ventilator echoed through the executive suite. "Natalie," Julian began. His voice was trembling, but he desperately tried to mask his panic with that same old condescending tone of a benevolent dictator. "We are willing to overlook this massive mistake of yours. Come back to the tower right now. Unlock the core, and we can discuss reinstating your employment." Before he could finish his pathetic attempt at saving face, a new voice cut across the line. It was sharp, authoritative, and completely devoid of Julian's pathetic desperation. "Ms. Ward, this is Vivian Croft, chairwoman of the board." I recognized the name immediately. The apex predator of the Aegis Empire had finally arrived to clean up the mess. "Good afternoon, Vivian," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "I am happy to report that my husband just made it through a grueling 7-hour surgery. He is finally out of the critical danger zone, which means I am now fully available to discuss business." "Excellent," Vivian responded coldly. "Tell me exactly what it will take to get my national logistics network moving again. Name your price." I looked down at Mark's battered, bruised hand, resting on the crisp white sheets, and I gently laced my fingers through his. All the anger and the suffocating fear from the previous night had completely washed away, leaving only a crystal-clear sense of absolute justice. "I do not want a salary increase, Vivian," I said softly, yet my voice projected with absolute clarity over the boardroom speaker. "I do not want a promotion, and I do not want an executive title. I only have 3 non-negotiable conditions for the decryption keys." Julian let out a heavy breath in the background, clearly expecting me to demand a massive cash payout. "Condition number 1, I stated, my tone turning to ice. "Fiona Thorne is to be terminated effectively immediately. Furthermore, the board will completely strip her of all invested and preferred stock options due to gross negligence." I could hear a muffled, frantic gasp from Fiona on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of her stumbling backward against a chair. "Condition number 2, I continued, ignoring the background noise. "Julian Sterling will submit his immediate resignation to the national press before the market closes today. His official, public reason for stepping down will be catastrophic executive incompetence." "You arrogant little glitch!" Julian suddenly screamed into the microphone, completely losing whatever shred of dignity he had left. "You cannot make those demands. I built this company. You are nothing." "And my third condition," I continued smoothly, completely talking over his pathetic temper tantrum. "Aegis Freight Networks will immediately establish a permanent emergency relief fund for all corporate and frontline employees. It will be endowed with exactly $50 million. If an employee needs emergency medical leave, they get it, fully paid. No questions asked. Those are my terms." Julian was practically hyperventilating, screaming at Vivian to hang up the phone and call the federal authorities. But Vivian Croft did not even flinch. She knew exactly what a $50 million fund and 2 executive resignations cost, compared to the complete destruction of a $500 million infrastructure. "Your terms are fully accepted, Ms. Ward," Vivian replied, her voice smooth and unbothered. "I will have the legal paperwork drafted within the hour." I heard the heavy sound of the boardroom doors swinging open. Over the speakerphone, Vivian delivered her final command to the room. "Security, escort Mr. Sterling and Ms. Thorne out of my building. Do not let them pack their desks." The line went completely dead. I sat in the quiet, dim light of the hospital room and pulled up the master administrative terminal on my phone. I typed in the final, complex string of biometric passcodes and pressed the execute button. In that exact second, thousands of miles away, the massive server racks lit up with a brilliant green glow. 12,000 heavy freight trucks fired up their engines. The heartbeat of the nation started pulsing once again. I locked my screen and placed the phone face down on the bedside table. Mark stirred slightly in his sleep, his fingers weakly squeezing mine. I smiled, a deep, overwhelming sense of relief washing over my entire soul. They thought power was measured by the size of a boardroom or the balance of a bank account. But they were entirely wrong. No corporate empire, no matter how vast or wealthy, will ever be worth more than the steady heartbeat of the person you love. Thank you all so much for listening to this story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please let me know your city or country in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's journey and found it captivating, I must sadly remind you that YouTube has completely demonetized this channel. We no longer have the budget to keep operating here, which means we will absolutely not be uploading new videos on this platform in the near future. Instead, we are transitioning all of our operations over to Patreon. Please help us keep creating by joining our Patreon community, where you can listen to the absolute best, most detailed, exclusive true stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can easily join us by scanning the Patreon QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the direct link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Thank you once again for your time, and I truly hope to see you there.